this fall. I'd like to introduce our ASL interpreter, Emily Phipps. Thank you, Emily, for interpreting for us at Common Hour. A very warm welcome to all at our 10th Common Hour of the semester. Common Hour is a unique and inclusive program that brings the Franklin and Marshall community together weekly during the academic year for culturally and intellectually enriching events. It is the only regularly scheduled event that unites students, faculty, and staff and invites the larger community to join us. Throughout the pandemic, the Common Hour has continued to provide a virtual gathering space and a source of inspiration, education, and compelling discussion for the F&M community and beyond. We hope you will join us during Common Hour next week for an F&M a cappella showcase in the Green Room Theater. It's not next week. Next week is Thanksgiving, but our next Common Hour after Thanksgiving will be in the Green Room Theater. During today's event, Zoom viewers can submit questions for our speakers via the Q&A feature. Please indicate your affiliation with the college, but we do not need your name. And now, I'd like to introduce Robel Tadesse, class of 2023, who will present today's speakers.
Thank you, Professor Stichura. Good morning. I would like to start by thanking all members of the Common Hour Committee for making this event possible. Thank you also to the audience for tuning in to what we strongly believe is an important discussion. In their undergraduate career, some 65% of Franklin and Marshall College students engage in research or one-on-one educational experiences under the guidance of a faculty mentor, and many head on to research institutions and graduate schools. In training to become the scientists and researchers of tomorrow, scholars need a diversity of viewpoints to cancel out one another's confirmation biases. This holds true in any educational environment in all fields of study, of course, but is the very appeal of a liberal arts education. Common Hour events emphasize a sense of common humanity. The name itself suggests that all of us who are here are on the same mission. It is important to keep this in mind. In an increasingly polarized society, it becomes all the more critical to protect the open and free expression of varying viewpoints on college campuses so that students do not fall prey to uncritical thinking. By highlighting our similarities rather than differences, educators have an obligation to provide an environment for students to engage varying viewpoints and practice thinking critically. It is our sincere hope that this conversation will spark further similar discussions and contribute to the mission to create the way forward together. Helping us have today's conversation are three individuals I will introduce to you. Courtnee Jordan-Cox is Assistant Dean of Student Affairs and House Dean of Rochelle College House. Dean Jordan-Cox will present us with a number of guidelines to ensure today's panel is a constructive discussion. Professor Stephen Cooper is a faculty member of the Religious Studies Department. Professor Cooper and I are faculty and student affiliates of a Heterodox Academy, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to improve the quality of research and education at universities by increasing open inquiry, constructive disagreement, and viewpoint diversity. His opening remarks will include the inspiration for today's panel on viewpoint diversity, as supported by research by Heterodox Academy. If you are interested in getting involved with Heterodox Academy, you can learn more by visiting heterodoxacademy.org. Sarah Pharaon, a 2000 grad of F&M, has built a career in museums, but moreover has worked for over 20 years to help nonprofit institutions have better conversations around difficult histories. Her firm, Dialogic Consulting, has worked with various nonprofit organizations ranging from museums to state parks. Previously, she has led 40 trainings for the National Park Service, consulted on the design of Eastern State Penitentiary's award-winning Prisons Today, Questions in the Age of Mass Incarceration, created programming for the Americans exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian, and managed the reinterpretation of the home of Nobel and Pulitzer Prize winner Earl S. Buck. With a wealth of experience in helping stakeholders navigate one-on-one and group conversations, Sarah has kindly agreed to facilitate today's panel discussion. Thank you very much, Sarah, Professor Cooper, and Dean Jordan-Cox. Without further ado, I will pass it on to Dean JC for her remarks.
Thank you so much, Robel. I'm so excited, along with Stephen Cooper and Sarah Pharaon, to get this conversation started. I want to lay out a few guides for our conversation. I would suggest to you that these are things that you can use as a practical skill when you facilitate dialogue and conversations as well. So the first thing that we are going to do is accept the cultural and ideological differences of others. That means really accepting the wide range of responses and viewpoints that we will hear today. The second is suspending personal judgment, making sure that we are evaluating things with a fair and open mind. Next, we will seek common ground between ourselves and others, and talking using I statements to really focus on our individual perspectives and make sure to avoid large, broad brush stereotypes. Next, demonstrating empathy for others in our interactions and making sure that we are being compassionate to our humanness as we discover new parts of our perspectives. We ask that each of you who are tuning in, as well as our panelists, be fully present with us today. And lastly, what's said here stays here, and what's learned here leaves here. So feel free to pick up and talk about the ideas and your thoughts, anything that's sparked or inspired, but I would discourage you from taking away conversations about the individual panelists themselves or their experiences personally. So take away the ideas, but try to leave the vulnerable pieces that people might discuss just right here in this room. Thank you so much. And I'll hand it off to Professor Stephen Cooper, and he will give you our next piece of information before we move to our panel.
Well, thank you, Dean JC, for those wise and informative words. I am here this morning as one of the co-sponsors of this Common Hour because I agree with the mission statement of Heterodox Academy of seeking, and I quote, to improve the quality of research and education in universities by increasing open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. Heterodox Academy is an organization made up of more than 5,000 professors, educators, administrators, and students from a range of institutions. And I joined because of my lifetime commitment to the aims and ideals of higher education as the social space made possible by and in furtherance of the great 18th century movement we call the Enlightenment. To this era, we owe our institutions of democracy, imperfect and incomplete though they are, and the acknowledgement of the inherent dignity of all human beings, even those with whom we may vehemently disagree. The discussion of opinions about how to get to facts and what to do once you have facts is not the same as the establishment of the facts themselves. Translating the Greek word heterodox gives us something like another opinion, a different opinion. The opposite of heterodox is orthodox. And as a scholar of early Christianity, I can say with some assurance that the reign of orthodoxies, the rule of right opinions, is hardly conducive either to the discovery of facts or to debating what is to be done on the basis of established facts. A free and healthy discussion of such opinions should be an essential part of a liberal arts education. It is schooling for citizenship in democracy, where even when we passionately disagree with our fellow citizens, we need to conduct ourselves so as to acknowledge common goods that we share, all our disagreements notwithstanding. So I think we have reason to be very interested in the survey conducted by Heterodox Academy in 2019, 2020, and 2021. This campus expression survey, as they have titled it, surveyed 1,300 college students in the US in order, I quote the final report, to empirically examine how often and why college students censor their opinions when discussing controversial topics. Here we have the slides.
Thanks so much, Professor Cooper, and as well to Robel for sharing those slides with us. Again, my name is Sarah Pharaon. It is a great pleasure to be back at Franklin and Marshall, though virtually, to have the opportunity to speak with so many students. Being as far out of my years at F&M as I am particularly interested in examining how this conversation and the conversations that are happening in Franklin and Marshall classrooms on a daily basis differ from what my experience was 23 years ago. With that, I have the great opportunity to introduce you to and share space with 7 current Franklin and Marshall students. And for all of you, I'm asking each of these students to share with us their name and year. If they feel it's helpful for us to know what their course of study is, to share that as well. And for all of our panelists, I'm asking that as you introduce yourself, I'd love for you to answer the question that follows. Speaking on the basis of your Franklin and Marshall experience thus far, what are the topics that you have found to be controversial or possibly difficult to discuss? And I want to acknowledge that the understanding that something is controversial or difficult is a very subjective and personal understanding of an issue and of what happened. With that said, I'd like to turn the mic to Bryn to start us with our introductions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bryn Rockovitz. I'm a senior moral psychology major here at F&M. I think one of the hardest things to discuss during my time at F&M was probably COVID protocol. I started school in the fall of 2019 and the pandemic hit shortly after. And I think during that time, a lot of people had varying opinions on what the college should do or not do. And I think that was definitely something that a lot of us struggled to have conversations about.
Thanks, Bryn. Appreciate it. Eric?
Hello, I'm Eric Lilgard. I'm a senior math physics double major here at Franklin and Marshall. And I think I'm also an HA, and so as my job as an HA, one of the hardest conversations or one of the hardest aspects of my job is facilitating conversations with individuals who have differing identities, so whether that be socioeconomical or cultural. I think aspects such as gender, financial status, and stuff like that have been some of the hardest conversations I've had with students, especially when it comes to trying to develop a sort of relationship among other students and generating a community.
Thanks, Eric. And Zayu, I wonder if you would answer as well, since I know you and Eric are sharing the same feed.
Sure. So hi, my name is Zayu Wang. I'm a senior English and classics double major. And on to answer your question, I just wanted to bring a different perspective. I would encourage us to recognize that the fact that we are concerned about difficulty in conversations, that itself is a privilege, because people, when people are uncomfortable talking about things, they just don't talk about it at all. So I think it's important to recognize that and think about how to extend that privilege to that privilege of speaking freely to other people. I don't necessarily have an answer or solution to this, but I just think that's the larger problem that we will all have to deal with.
Thanks so much. And I want to acknowledge the importance of that, and with an understanding that I hope to come back to that as we continue to talk. And so Zayu, I hope you'll come back to that as well. This idea of how discomfort might possibly lead to silence, and in some ways that silence coming from a space of self-censorship, right? Or feelings of censorship from others. And with that, can we hear from Kyle?
Hi, I'm Kyle. I'm a senior, a government major, Russian studies minor. Being in the government department, politics has kind of obviously been one that's a controversial topic to talk about. But it's something for me, at least, that I think has been limited to the initial start of my time here, but also like the initial start of classes. I feel like people with politics, as you start to kind of add bit by bit, it's something that, people are getting more and more comfortable with. And the further you get away from certain political figures, the more comfortable people also get with talking about it. So I think at the start of my time in 2019, politics was a lot more controversial than it has been recently on campus.
Thanks, Kyle. And just a recognition that, entering into this conversation, this idea of time and distance, right, from topics, and how that makes things feel possibly easier to communicate and to discuss with others. And for others, how that might make a topic harder, right? Because the time that has gone forward may have also relayed feelings that others now feel it's unimportant, right? Even if we hold it important to ourselves. Can we go to Liz?
Hi, I'm Liz. I'm a junior and I am also a government major like Kyle. Similar to Eric, I am also an HA, which I think makes controversial topics particularly challenging for this role. Not only are you a facilitator and a mentor and hopefully, ideally, a role model, but your residents are also your peers, so having difficult conversations with that added layer can be challenging. I think in particular, matters of conduct in Title IX are really controversial at times on campus, whether that be specific circumstances or personal histories, or something that students maybe just do not understand, particularly for HAs being in that role, talking about the conduct process can be very difficult. And a lot of students tend to have very strong opinions when it comes to conduct.
Thanks, Liz. Valerie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie. I'm a sophomore and I'm thinking of majoring in psychology. To give some credit to the F&M community, this is one of the most diverse communities I have been so far. I grew up in like a Jewish day school and I have been surrounded by peers that are also Jewish. So coming here, it has been an amazing experience because I have been able to hear a lot of different perspectives. And I have been able to grow just by learning new ways of living. But at the same time, during class, I sometimes do feel with certain topics that like I'm not allowed, not allowed, but I feel a little sometimes ashamed to like speak out or like say like what I think are my values or my beliefs, just because I think that the majority of the class thinks differently than me. And it's not like something that it's really happening. It's just a feeling that I get from the class. But I do think that professors do an amazing job encouraging people to say what they believe.
Thanks, Valerie. Christy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Sears. I am a sophomore and I'm a history anthropology joint major. I'm also an HA in one of the college houses. So as it was said before, being an HA and also being a peer to some of the students here, it makes it kind of difficult to have these kind of conversations. But at the same time, for me personally, what I've seen, especially in like what we know in these past few months, I think politics is what makes it is very much a controversial topic on campus, because there have been circumstances where people have been attacked for stating a view that happens to be different from a majority viewpoint. And in my personal opinion, I think that's as a whole where I think we need to be able to grow, because just because someone has a disagreeing view from you doesn't mean that they deserve to be attacked for that specific view. And so I think that's where we really as a community need to be able to grow as such.
Christy, I'm going to ask you to keep your camera on because now we've gotten through the introductions. And so you happen to be in the unfortunate position of being the last intro. And what that means is I'd love to take the opportunity to follow up on something you said, which was that, you have witnessed across the 2 years that you've been there, a a feeling that people were attacked because of a difference in what you've described as a more political identity or a political belief. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that, what that looks like? Attack's a big word, right?
Yeah,
So what does that mean?
So predominantly what I say when I say come to, in regards to being attacked, I think I've seen people very much like shun other people for stating their viewpoints. I've seen where they will like, it's like a complete shutdown of like that conversation. It's like they don't want to continue on with the conversation. And while I mean, in the past few months, in the past just couple of years, politics have been something that's kind of rotating our entire lives. And so I think if a person is disagreeing with someone else's viewpoint, that's I think the time where we shouldn't shut down the conversation, because I think we need to be able to actually have that proper conversation and say like, okay, why do you believe in this viewpoint? Tell me exact reasonings. Like, why do you follow this person? Like, why is this your belief? Because then if I understand why you believe it, I may not agree with you, but at least I can understand where you're coming from. And that's something I know my own self I need to like do better with. But at the same time, I also think it's like we as a whole community need to be able to not just be like, you're canceled now, like we're not going to ever talk to you again. I think we need to be able to be like, okay, like where are you coming from, so I can understand. Yeah.
Thanks, Christy. I'm going to be opening the conversation for all of our respondents at this point. So please, to all of our students, as we continue to discuss, if Christy has said something that you would like to follow up on, or if I ask a question you'd like to follow up on, there are many of you. So if you could raise your hand, I'll be able to know, even while you're off camera, that you'd like me to come to you. With that, I'd like to, open up a little bit this idea of difficult, right? And what actually makes these conversations difficult. There are a group of scholars and writers in a book called Difficult Conversations who make the assertion that every difficult conversation we have is actually 3 conversations that are happening at the same time. We're having one conversation about what actually has happened, right? Sometimes we would consider that the forensic truth, right, of an issue or of an incident. The second conversation is how that incident or those moments made us feel, the emotion of the conversation, whether we feel, in Christy's words, attacked, right, as something is being said or heard. And the third conversation is whether the topic, the things that were said, shore up, reinforce, or shake up our own personal identities and the way that we see ourselves and the way we function in the world. I wanted to push that forward because I see some similarities in some of the things you've identified as being difficult. And I wonder how that sits. And what is it, if you have to think about all of the things you've mentioned, that has really made those conversations feel difficult? For the HAs, right? You named an identifier, being of the same peer age group as some of the folks that you are engaging with around challenging issues, right? That would fall into 3, your identities and how that influences a space. But what else? What do you see in common with what makes any of these conversations that are happening difficult? Yeah, Valerie.
I think that some of the things that make it difficult is when you're talking to someone and the person thinks that their truth is the only truth. So that just makes it difficult, because it's nice when I have also had other different conversations with people where we can exchange ideas and perspectives, and the conversation flows even though we have totally different perspectives. But when you have a conversation with someone that thinks that their truth is the truth, then it's very hard to like share your opinion or like exchange ideas.
Thanks, Valerie. Similar or different for the rest of you? Is that what's at the core? Eric or Zayu, I'm not sure which one.
So sort of building off of that, I think also when someone they're expressing their own truth and they seem to be very strong about that, it sort of asks a question of the other people: should I challenge that person's truth? Should I share my own truth? And specifically going back to the HA role, when you're sort of seen as like a mentor or, you know, like this leader figure to others, you also have to think about, is this my time to share my truth, or should I, you know, facilitate the opportunity to allow others to share their truths? And I think this also sort of harps on one of the questions that we'll get to later, so I'll hold back on that.
Thanks, Eric. Truth is such a hard way to think, right? You know, we're raised to think of truth as one thing, but you know, many scholars have talked about the existence of multiple truths. You know, we've talked about already in this conversation forensic or personal, but there are social truths too, right? Narratives that we as a society accept as true or accept as important, whether they're true or not. And reconciliatory truths, right? The stories, the narratives we tell ourselves as a society in order to heal. Kyle, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I was just going to try and tie what Eric said to Christy, and kind of when you get into truths, I find that people are a lot more passionate about it and a lot less willing to engage. But, you know, that kind of runs into the position where you may feel attacked based on how somebody else is expressing their views. And it's kind of challenging to stay calm yourself and respond in like a calm, cool, and collected manner to somebody who is arguing their truth versus your truth. And it kind of puts you in a position where it isn't necessarily informative for either party when you get into this place where it's kind of aggression back and forth, or, you know, just trying to push your truth on another instead of trying to explain why you actually, you know, think that in the first place.
Yeah, Kyle, you gave us a great segue, I think, into talking about this specifically, you know, kind of within an academic classroom. And I wonder if I might ask all of you this. The Franklin and Marshall Mission and History Statement affirms that, and I quote, dedication to intellectual freedom and critical learning is vital, right, to an F&M experience and education. And speaking to your experience, are we living up to our mission of affirming our ongoing dedication to intellectual freedom and critical learning? Christy.
I think in my own personal experience and in my time here at F&M so far, I think at times we are living up to our message, you know, because we, like, as Valerie had said earlier, we do have to give F&M credit. Like, we are taking our steps forward and we are becoming more diverse every year. But at the same time, I feel that there are circumstances, as I said before, that because people can get so passionate about like what they believe is their truth, they shut off any thought of like something else. They fulfill themselves in a way where they'll learn about what they want to learn, and they'll learn about like what they deem as their truth. But at times, you know, they don't have the ability to like really open themselves up to a wider world, which I think is doing a disservice here to F&M, because we do have such a wide open world and what we're able to do here. So I think it's, like I said, it's a bit of a twofold, where it's like we are leaning towards our mission, but at times it's like personally we also are not leaning towards our mission as well.
Thanks, Christy. Again, that intersection, right, of quote unquote forensic and personal truths. And I want to call out the challenge of that specifically at an institution dedicated to a liberal arts education, right, where that's a big part of our goal, is to help us examine and look at the different types of histories and narratives and learning. Any other thoughts, y'all, on where we are at in living up to our mission? Valerie.
Well, I just wanted to give like a specific example. In class, I took like an English class the past semester, and I feel like just by writing something personal, like creative writing assignment, you can express your viewpoints and share with the class, which is something beautiful. And just by like listening to the other, like to my peers work, I'm able to just like have that intellectual conversation and critical thinking. So yeah.
Thanks, Valerie. Liz, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, so my experience with the Gov department, first of all, I think I'm very fortunate to be in such a phenomenal department. But the professors that I've had in the Gov department have really honed in on this mission. I think they've tried explicitly to kind of intertwine those personal identities with the way that we think about government. So, two examples, I had political theory with Professor Hammer, and he would really base his assignments around talking about your own personal experiences and reflecting on your own identity and how that may intertwine with your own personal political theory. And I think that gives students a really great opportunity to consider their own personal experiences and how that may have shaped their viewpoints. And then just yesterday, I'm in campaigns and elections with Professor Medvick, and he asked us to all consider our first political memory. The moment that maybe we asked our parents, like, who are we voting for? Or what party do we support? And we had this really fantastic open conversation in class about how students have really been shaped by their experiences through life, and that's why they have the certain political affiliation that they do or have certain belief sets that other students might not have. And I think just putting that dialogue into the classroom and making it a safe space for students to talk about their identities and their views at the same time really does help that F&M mission.
Liz, thanks so much for raising that. And I think it also references something Christy talked about earlier, right? This idea of sometimes simply asking that question, right? Of how have you come to that, right? Or, what has your experience been with, right? When I engage in some of the most challenging topics of dialogue with audiences at museums around the country, I'm very interested in having every respondent answer the question of what do I need to know about you in order to understand how you come to this topic, right? Which it sounds exactly like what your professor was doing in that question, in that space. Anyone else around the idea of what's happening in your classrooms with great respect for what we've already heard? Eric or Zayu, whoever's on.
So I think, also looking into the sort of the classroom at F&M, as well as, we have such large access to such different classrooms. Like we just had course registration the other week. And some of my first year residents, they were complaining about classes that they didn't get, like, oh, they didn't get their boss class that they wanted. But then I had to remind them, it's like, well, you have this opportunity to take classes that you might have never thought you'd want to take before or never thought you could take before. And this immediately calls me to one of the classes that I took, which was Intro to Asian Art with Richard Kent, the Don of Ware College House. Never have I ever thought I would take a class on Asian art, learning about ancient bronze vessels or anything of the such. But coming from the physics and math department, he made it so accessible to me to jump into a completely new topic that was foreign to me. And I think that's what F&M has done the best for me, and I think for all the students, is give us these opportunities to put ourselves outside of our comfort zone, both inside and outside of the class, whether that's through clubs, common hours such as this, or especially independent studies, because that allows students to pursue passions or pursue their own truths that they may not be able to explore to the degree that they want to in their regular classes.
Thanks, Eric. Two things I hear in that as well that are interesting to me is the differences of the fields of study that we're in, right? And the conversations that may happen, right? Maybe frequently, maybe less frequently, around kind of our you said physics, I think, and math, right? Spaces, and what that looks like in a space that some of you I know also come from in terms of, moral psychology or philosophy, right? And other history. So I'm curious about that difference for all of you. And if there is one in a space like F&M, so dedicated towards a liberal arts education. And we have a few people waiting. So before I really hone in on professors and their role in creating environments that are open for effective dialogue, I want to make sure I grab Kyle and Bryn as well. So Kyle, you want to go first and then Bryn?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say that there's a lot of ways that F&M kind of promotes dialogue that's outside of the campus. One of my favorite ones that I think is kind of underused right now is the protest tree. I remember my freshman year, it was a constant battle between different signs, who could put them up higher and stuff like that. And there are just like subtle ways that we can kind of express our opinions. And it doesn't have to be political. It doesn't have to be religious or anything like that. It can even just be about campus itself. And I feel like the protest tree is just another way that we as students can voice our opinions if we feel the need to. So I think it kind of goes beyond just the classroom. So
awesome. Thanks, Kyle. Bryn.
Where is this? I just wanted to touch on a little bit about like F&M does a really well job of providing opportunities for students to like take initiative in their studies. And I think that is one way they move forward about dedicating to like intellectual freedom. I know one thing is like in the SPM department that's super interdisciplinary, and they really stress the importance of like student-led research. I also think it's what like 2/3 of students at F&M do one-on-one research at some point at F&M, and I think that is something that really important that goes on at this institution that might not be happening elsewhere.
Thanks, Brent. Appreciate that glimpse that maybe some of us tuning in didn't experience or have specifically at the times that we were there. I'd like to open up the conversation around another question. When we think about our time at Franklin and Marshall and knowing that we have a community that is built of students and alums and professors and the town of Lancaster and other spaces, I want to hone in on a sense of a responsibility. And what is the role or responsibility of professors and administrators in supporting the intellectual journey of each of you when it comes to having difficult conversations? Let me say that one again. What is the role of professors and administrators in supporting each of your intellectual journeys when it comes to having difficult or hard conversations? What is your hope and your expectation of them? Christy.
So for me, like when in college, whenever I thought of college and just like teachers and professors in general, I've always seen them as someone who is a guiding force in like our development and our conversations. And, and even at times, say like our facilitators in like discussions. Considering I'm a history and anthropology major, I happen to have like a lot of discussions, a lot of like roundtable type talks and the like. And for me personally, what I've always appreciated with my professors is that they have been able to give us they have been able to give us that space to have these very hard conversations. There have been circumstances where if like an event has occurred where they're like a really big event or something, they will take the time and be like and say, hey, let's talk about this situation instead of going on with the lesson. Because I think instead, because I sometimes we're always like, we got to focus on school. But I think if we're able to focus on these like real world events and really just take that break away from classes and stuff, like it really helps with the conversations we had before. And I've had many circumstances where my teachers, they've paused class and said, like, we're going to talk about the issues that happened before, like say like regarding to politics or something real world, especially if they connect to like our classes. So like my history class last semester, we were talking I was in Europe in the 20th century with Maria Mitchell, and we were talking kind of like about like elections that were currently going on in Europe and kind of like what does that mean in like a real world scheme here in modern day politics. And I thought that was just, I really appreciated that because not only are we applying what we're learning here in class, we're also applying in what's going on in our own actual lives as well. So.
Thanks, Christy. Selfishly, I will say that I'm very much enjoying hearing so many professors' names that I recognize. It makes me feel a little less distanced from my time there. Bryn, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think Christy just summed it up really well about professors acting as like facilitators. I know this is one thing that we tried to stress a lot in connections courses. I had an opportunity to precept for 2 connections courses, and I think one thing that we really wanted is for students to feel comfortable sharing. And at first it like took them a while as they were like new to campus. But I think if professors and other administrators just make it a safe space and keep reiterating that, I think they'll start to learn that discussion is something that's okay to do in college.
Thanks, Bryn. And Kyle?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on another specific professor that I had, Professor Medvik, who kind of asked all of the students in my class for connections to consider the opposite. And I always thought that that was a good way to kind of promote debate and dialogue, because instead of arguing your own views, we had to argue basically the opposite view to ours. But, you know, I think that only goes so far, because there are going to be certain truths that, you know, there isn't really an opposite that you can consider. You know, there are certain events and denials of events that, you know, aren't something that we really want to flip and try and consider. But that being said, you know, when it comes down to how to handle issues and how to address certain, you know, problems we're facing in this country or on campus, you know, we always can consider the opposite to a certain extent, which, you know, I think is helpful because it reinforces your own beliefs and, you know, even makes you more capable to challenge the other belief as well. So I've always found that that was something that was particularly helpful in my time.
Thanks, Kyle. I want to hear from Liz, and then I want to ask a follow-up. You've all mentioned a few mechanisms that have been helpful to you as well in the classroom. So I want to make sure to give time to get back to that. Liz, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, just to kind of second what Kyle said, also shouting out Professor Medvik again. He posed a question to our class a few weeks ago that I've been thinking about ever since, which is in regards to thinking about political parties. The question, what would it take for you to not vote for your party? Which has been really interesting for me this semester. I've had 2 kind of like contradictory roles this fall. I was interning on a political campaign, but also serving as a co-chair for F&M Votes, which is a nonpartisan organization on campus. And when I'm in my role with F&M Votes, I am very committed to being nonpartisan, making sure that students register to vote and saying any party is a good party. You should just register. And so I think questions like that, they really do go beyond the classroom and allow students to start thinking from that other perspective, just like Kyle had said.
Thanks, Liz. I want to pose one last question to the group, and then I want to turn it over to Anne so that we can create a space to answer some of the questions for our panelists that have come in from everyone who is taking of their time to join us today. My last question to all of you, part of it you have already answered, right? We heard Kyle speak about a mechanism of engaging in almost debate, but doing it from a perspective that might be opposite from your own, right? Or Liz, you referenced a strategy utilized by a professor in order to say, again, if you had to do this, right, what are the boundaries of how you identify politically? We also saw, you know, our Dean JC say these are guidelines, right, for the conversation that we were having today. And so I'm curious what else, if anything, you have seen that used on campus that has been either helpful in opening up more effective dialogue as a technique or a mechanism, or are there things that you've seen done that you felt were challenging and more detrimental towards pushing effective dialogue? All right. That one seems to have stumped our panelists, which might be an indication of how challenging these questions are sometimes, right? How do we take an environment like a classroom, right, that is ostensibly set up for dialogue, right? Many of you read multiple perspectives in between any of your class meetings before coming, and balance the idea that you are in an environment that is graded, right? And that you are in an environment where you are, as many of our HAs have mentioned, living and working and speaking with each other, and that you're also working in an era of social media where there are larger and often held repercussions for beliefs that are brought up in both academic and non-academic settings. I'd very much like to turn over our Q&A moment to Anne so that she can share with us one of the questions that has come from our group. And I am sure that you have chosen the most interesting and challenging of questions for our panelists. And I'm happy to offer any thoughts as well as we move forward.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much to our student panel and all of the presenters today. I just want to say before I begin, we're also getting a lot of compliments of how wonderful our students' answers have been from staff and from administrators. Kudos to our students. They never cease to amaze me with their openness, engagement, and intelligence. So just want you to know this is very appreciated. But we did have a student question, and a student asks, could anyone touch on the fact that certain people's truths may put certain marginalized groups in danger, and the issues that come with prioritizing these harmful views and rhetorics?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Let me open that up to the students first, and with acknowledgement that some of you individually may or may not have had experience with this on campus, so that we might be creating a space for you to speak personally, and we might also be creating a space for you to recognize and that this is a larger issue as well, right? That might be happening for other students on campus if it's not something you've seen. Yeah, Kyle.
Yeah, I think a good example of this that I've seen recently in the news is the trial for Alex Jones, who claimed that Sandy Hook never happened, and a lot of his followers, kind of echoed the same sentiments. I think there are certain truths or opinions that people have that just fundamentally conflict with what reality is, and I think that puts us in a position where there is no alternative but harm for those who are on the receiving end of opinions like that. And you can go on with the examples endlessly of stuff like that, but I think there are always going to be certain things that just fundamentally can't really be considered somebody's truth, when in reality we've seen so much evidence to the opposite. So I think it is a hard conversation to have, to allow all people to continue to perceive their beliefs as truths, and we've seen the court actually take action with that. So
thanks, Kyle. Christy?
Yeah, this is a question. So I think like Kyle said, it's like when it comes to certain things where there are a lot of facts behind it, that says the other than this person's truth, then that's a situation where it's like it no longer kind of becomes your truth. It's just kind of the general known. But I think in regards to this question about the fact that certain people's truth can put certain marginalized groups in danger, I really do feel closely related with this question in regards to I have heard of some things that have put people who look like me, especially in these very concerning moments. And I feel like there's a difference of an actual a person's belief in say simply you believe the sky is yellow or something, and I believe the sky is blue, and that's factual, that's put up to facts. But I feel at the same time it's there's a part where if it's harmful, if it's hurtful to someone, then I don't think it really can be, like, it may be your truth, but then it's like as a whole thing, I don't really know if it can be someone's truth. This is a really hard question, because you want to always give the space for someone to have that ability to say their words and say their truth, as we say. But at the same time, it's like, if that truth is harmful to someone else and it hurts someone else and it hurts a certain group of people, that's when it becomes a situation of like, well, maybe there is that possibility of like the censoring or something. So I don't know. I don't know if I answered the question properly, but yeah.
I don't think there's a properly here, right? Just to validate that for you, Christy, I think that especially when we're talking about feeling and emotion, but also the very real dangers that can come from those spaces, there isn't one right answer. I have a few things I'd love to share as techniques we use within some of the more challenging spaces that we work in, but I want to give Valerie an opportunity to share her answer first.
I think that, as Christy said, like, this is a very hard question to answer, but I think that the main key in order to have like a good conversation and also share like your opinions, your truths, it's important just to have like the right attitude. And that is like, are you coming like with a hateful attitude, or are you coming with a curious attitude? Because we could have like different perspectives, totally different opinions. But if we're coming with an attitude of curiosity, of learning, of like accepting the other person, then I think it's just much easier to have that conversation despite the differences.
Thanks, Valerie. And especially to the student who raised this is a really challenging topic and a challenging issue in having effective dialogue. Two things to just make sure they are placed into the conversation. One of which is, as a facilitator who specifically works with sites of trauma and sites that are talking and sharing contested histories, I often work with sites and their teams to say, just because you are engaging in dialogue does not mean that there aren't boundaries for that dialogue. And so I would never ask a site of the Holocaust like Tadesse in the Czech Republic to say, to entertain dialogue on whether the Holocaust happened, right? That's not up for dialogue. And it's okay for that not to be up for dialogue in our academic settings and classrooms. We, as an F&M community, do have the ability to determine what those boundaries are. And it's necessary that we do so, because if we don't set those boundaries, then we give everyone affiliated with our community less integrity in every difficult conversation that they enter, because they can't assess what is up for dialogue and what's not within the community that we are building and creating, right, on any given day or basis. The other thing I specifically want to call out for that student is, and for any student, is you also do have the ability to practice your own self-care in entering into these conversations or not. So, for instance, I worked at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City for quite some time. And I could have conversations as a white, upper middle class, cisgendered woman around concepts of immigration, most days with very little personal repercussions, right? Very little personal self at stake. That was not something that every one of the facilitators that I supervised and worked with could do. And so there also is a space in which it is fine for you to not have to engage dialogically, right? To not have to say, how did you come to that? To not have to engage if you're at a point in which it is dangerous for you individually to continue to engage in that discussion. Those personal and collective boundaries are extremely important for Franklin and Marshall to continue to consider. Back to you, Anne.
That is great advice. And we've had a couple of questions that are similar, asking about that balance, or how can there be a balance of wanting to not shut off conversations, or where's the line between allowing people to express their opinions and enabling hate? So could you talk a little bit about how to determine those boundaries? I think that's what these questions are about.
And is your hope that I would answer that specifically?
Well, I think maybe this is a conversation for the F&M community. So
yeah,
what do you guys think?
Yeah, I would love to hear from the students, you know, around how you are thinking about and negotiating that. Conversations rooted in hate and an understanding of what hate speech is or looks like feels like it should be definitive. And I think that there are pieces of that that are definitive. And there are other pieces of that that vary depending on the cultural climates that I'm often in. So I'm really curious what the experience of you all has been in this space and where you're moving from. Zayu or Eric?
It's Eric this time. So I think you raised a really good point, saying that we kind of live on this spectrum with respect to conversations and dialogue that we have, especially within our own identities. We may identify a certain conversation with like certain triggers from like past experiences. And so I think it's really important to sort of read the room that you're in, you know, possibly have a conversation before the conversation even begins on, you know, just getting to know each other, saying, what are we trying to get out of this experience together? Sort of harkening back to like HA training, we like to set a goal at the beginning of every meeting or every crew meeting that we have with residents. And so part of that sort of initial conversation is, you know, where do we want this to go? What are our objectives, and what are some things that we have to be mindful of, especially given maybe some people who are with us in the room or from our own personal experiences.
Thanks, Eric. Liz?
Yeah, you asked kind of like what the line is, and I think what's really important to remember is that at an institution like Franklin and Marshall, the priority is education, and you are a student first, and that F&M is going to have to prioritize making sure that everyone has their right to be a student and their right to feel comfortable going into the classroom and feel like they can go to the library and go to these safe spaces and be a student above all else. So if F&M has to limit, I know Kyle brought up the protest tree earlier, if there have to be limitations on the protest tree so that every student feels safe and able to be an academic student here at this college, that is what F&M has to prioritize at the end of the day.
Thanks, Liz. Appreciative of that as well. I will offer this phrase, which is one that I use when comments that I would say are in a space of hate or in that border space that always feels a little unsure because I can recognize that the intent may not be hateful, but the impact is, right? And there's a difference in those things. I often will stop the person who is saying it, you know, as it's happening, or at least immediately after it is said, and say something along the lines of, I understand that you're trying to relay something that you feel passionate about, but the words you're using and the way you're saying it are stopping the rest of us from hearing what you intend us to hear. And I think that honors, Liz, your point about this being about education and you know, and almost that Maslow's, you know, hierarchy that people's ability to feel safe, which we recognize is a different term for different people, right? That looks different for different individuals, is a real priority if we are attempting to build a learned community in any way.
Thank you all so much for your answers to that very challenging question. I just want to, we have time for maybe one more question. And so I wanted to ask about A question from staff. This is from a staff member who says, 2 topics that I would like to discuss on campus, but do not for fear of losing friendships, losing reputation, being labeled as a hater or bigot, and or making students or staff who feel otherwise or come from those countries feel bad or attacked are the actions of the state of Israel towards Palestinians and the genocide of the Uyghurs in China. I think the question here is, how can you talk about things that you have opinions about if you feel that they won't be received well?
I was about to say any of our panelists, and they're jumping at this one. Christy, what are you thinking about?
So I think this kind of relates to what we were talking about earlier, about like there's this kind of shutdown of like having the ability for these conversations. And I think in the specific ones mentioned, they're such a prominent thing in all of our lives, kind of more for certain people than otherwise. And I think we should have the ability to at least say what our belief is about a certain situation first and foremost, without any sort of judgment before, and have that conversation. And so I think this is what, as a community, we all need to work on, is that we need to be able to reserve our judgment before we hear someone speak, because until we hear someone speak, like, we don't know what they're coming from. Like, we could have already had this whole thing in our mind and our whole thought process, and then they come and tell us the situation, and we are like surprised because it's a whole different thing than what we're thinking of. So I think we need to be able to, say our thoughts on the situation, while also acknowledging that like someone else is going to feel differently than you, and that is okay. Just because you're one thing, just because you believe in one thing doesn't mean that everyone needs to believe in that entire thing. It's kind of like that hive mentality, is like we need to kind of break away from the hive mentality and actually think like, okay, like, I am my own person. I have my own thoughts. My thoughts may align with someone else's, but at the same time, I do have my own thoughts. And if my thoughts are different than what the majority is, then that is okay, I think. And there shouldn't be that fear of like being canceled. But I think that it's kind of hard in that situation.
Christy, I want to thank you for that. I know we're coming up on the end of our time. So if I may, because I hear in that question a request for a specific technique, right? A helping hint. And I would say, I would reference what I opened the session with, that 1, 2, 3 of difficult conversations. And I would say that in my experience, other than the identity question, which is why we typically feel differently, I think what you're referencing, your best technique is to focus on the 1. To work on, do we have a common understanding of what happened? Because the fact of the matter is that there are so many narrators who are narrating current events, who are narrating histories, who are narrating things about our world to each other. And so it's why the world that I work in museums and cultural orgs, and why your academic setting actually can be great for dialogue, is that if you want to have those conversations, make sure that you are both hold in common some piece of understanding of what you are talking about. It's highly likely that you have different sets of information that you are working from, and that's why you are finding yourselves in debate rather than dialogue. Also, critically examine for yourself, am I really interested in dialogue, or am I actually just interested in being right? And if really what you're interested in being right is, then you need to be able to give the folks you want to discuss things with more integrity as well. With that being said, I know we have to sign, but I do want to acknowledge one Q&A that came in, which I think is just very important, which is a comment along the lines of, there is a problem or a challenge with equating controversial topics or issues with identities and identity groups. And it is a concern I have about the way that we frame things sometimes in our society. And I deal with this with historic sites all the time, right? The nature of talking about the history of slavery isn't in and of itself controversial, right? It is about how we come to that topic and how it makes us feel that is controversial. Similarly, identity groups are not controversial. It is the ways in which our identities intersect with topics that are challenging and controversial. And so I want to make sure that that's said in this space. And I so appreciate the comment in the Q&A about that as well. No identity is controversial in and of itself. It is everything else that surrounds it. With that being said, I'm going to stop talking and give it back to Anne for we can wrap.
Thank you so much. This was an incredible conversation, and I know that the audience was very grateful to all of you for organizing this, for participating. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you not next week, the week after for our Common Hour.